My hands trembled as I applied lipstick in the rearview mirror, the same shade of coral I'd worn for 43 years of marriage. The parking lot of Rossetti's Italian restaurant stretched before me, filled with cars that seemed to mock my Honda Civic's age. At 67, I felt like a teenager again, but not in the way the magazines promised. This was the terrifying kind of young, the kind where your stomach churns and your palms sweat, and you wonder if you've made a terrible mistake. "Margaret, you're being ridiculous," I whispered to my reflection, but my voice cracked on the words. 3 months since Robert passed, and here I was, preparing for my first date in over 4 decades. My daughter Linda had set this up, insisting that Dad would want you to be happy, Mom. But would he? Would he really want me sitting across from a stranger, pretending to be someone I wasn't sure I remembered how to be? The restaurant's neon sign flickered against the October evening sky, casting shadows that reminded me of the countless nights Robert and I had driven past this place, always meaning to try it, but never quite making the time. Now I was here alone, about to meet Harold, a widower from Linda's neighborhood who supposedly enjoyed crossword puzzles and had kind eyes. What did that even mean at our age? Kind eyes behind reading glasses? Kind eyes that had watched his own wife fade away? I checked my phone. 6:58 p.m. Harold would be expecting me in 2 minutes, and I still couldn't bring myself to leave the car. The coral lipstick felt foreign on my mouth, too bright, too hopeful. When was the last time I'd worn lipstick for someone other than church or the grocery store? When was the last time someone had looked at me, really looked at me, and seen a woman instead of just Robert's widow or Linda's mother? My reflection stared back, and I saw my mother's jawline, my grandmother's hands, 70 years of women who had loved and lost and somehow found the courage to keep going. But they hadn't had to navigate online dating profiles and coffee shop meetings at their age. They hadn't had to explain to well-meaning children why sitting alone at the dinner table every night felt like drowning in silence. The restaurant door opened, and a couple emerged, laughing at something private between them. The woman looked about my age, her silver hair catching the light, as her companion, a distinguished man with a walking cane, held the door. They moved with the easy familiarity of people who had found each other late in life, who had decided that love was worth the risk of looking foolish. I envied them. Taking a deep breath that tasted of autumn and possibility, I finally opened the car door. My knees protested, arthritis reminding me that this body had lived through decades of dinner preparations, garden work, and nights spent holding Robert's hand in hospital waiting rooms. These were hands that had changed diapers and signed mortgage papers and held grandchildren. Were they hands that could hold someone new? The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes of her own, greeted me with practiced warmth. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes, for 2, under Harold. Actually, I'm not sure of his last name." The admission felt embarrassing, like confessing to a crime. "My daughter arranged this. I'm meeting someone." "Oh, you must be Margaret. Yes, Harold Morrison is already seated. Right this way." Harold Morrison. Even his name sounded safe, dependable. As we walked through the dimly lit restaurant, past couples of all ages sharing pasta and wine, I caught glimpses of my reflection in the windows. The navy dress Linda had insisted I buy hung well on my frame, and the coral lipstick didn't look as desperate as I'd feared. I looked like someone who belonged here, someone who deserved an evening of conversation and maybe even laughter. Then I saw him. He sat at a corner table, studying the menu with the same concentration Robert had once applied to tax forms. Silver-haired, wearing a blue cardigan that reminded me of my father. And yes, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But there was something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. The way he held his left shoulder, slightly raised, as if protecting an old injury. The particular tilt of his head when he concentrated. The wedding ring still on his finger, worn and comfortable. This was not Harold Morrison. This was James Castellano, my first love, my almost husband, the man who had broken my heart 48 years ago when he left for California without saying goodbye. Our eyes met across the restaurant, and 48 years collapsed into nothing. I was 19 again, standing in my parents' kitchen, still wearing the dress I'd bought for our engagement party that never happened. He was 21, scared and ambitious, and certain that Seattle was too small for his dreams. We had been so young, so sure that love was enough, until we discovered it wasn't. His face went through the same transformation I felt in my own: shock, recognition, then a complicated mix of joy and panic. He started to stand, bumping the table and sending his water glass skating toward the edge. I rushed forward, my body moving on instinct, reaching for the glass just as he did. Our hands met, cold water spilling over both of us, and suddenly we were laughing the way we used to, helplessly and inappropriately. Margaret! His voice was deeper now, roughened by age and cigarettes he'd probably quit decades ago. My God, Margaret! Hello, James. I couldn't manage anything more sophisticated. This was the man who had taught me to drive stick shift, who had promised me forever, who had left me believing that love was something that happened to other people, luckier people. We stood there, dripping restaurant water, while the hostess hovered uncertainly and other diners glanced our way with mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Finally, James gestured to his chair. I think there's been some kind of mix-up, he said, his words careful and measured. But would you like to sit down anyway? I should have left. I should have called Linda and demanded an explanation, should have driven home to my empty house and my crossword puzzles and my safe, predictable grief. Instead, I found myself sliding into the seat across from him, my heart pounding against my ribs like it hadn't in decades. You look, he began, then stopped, shaking his head with a rueful smile. You look exactly like I remember, but also completely different. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. He looked like James, but James painted over with time, lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and worry, gray hair that had once been thick and dark, hands that moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to measure his words and actions. The boy I had loved was still there, but layered now with decades of living I knew nothing about. Harold Morrison, I said, that's who I was supposed to meet. Margaret Chin, he replied, that's who Linda said I'd be having dinner with. Your Linda? My Linda. A laugh escaped me, part hysteria, part admiration. She set this up. She actually, oh, that clever girl, she knew exactly who you were. James leaned back in his chair, and I caught a glimpse of the man he had become. Successful, judging by his clothes and the confidence in his posture, but marked by loss too. His wedding ring caught the candlelight. She called me 6 weeks ago, he said quietly. Said she'd found me through some alumni website. Said that Robert had passed. I'm so sorry, Margaret. I looked him up online afterward. He seemed like a good man. The kindness in his voice nearly undid me. Robert had been a good man, the best man I'd ever known, except for the 21-year-old boy sitting across from me who had broken my heart so completely I'd thought I'd never recover. He was, I managed, 43 years, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. A good life. I'm glad, James said, and I could tell he meant it. I always wondered. I always hoped you'd found someone who deserved you. The waiter appeared, young and patient, clearly accustomed to serving couples who needed time to navigate complicated histories. James ordered wine without asking me. Chianti, the same thing we'd shared on our last real date, the night before he disappeared from my life. Some details, I realized, never fade. As the wine arrived and we fumbled through the ritual of tasting and approving, I studied his face for clues about who he had become. Success, yes, but also sadness. The way his fingers worried at his wedding ring told me everything I needed to know about his own loss. "Tell me," I said when we were alone again. "Tell me about your life, the parts that matter." He laughed, a sound that carried echoes of the boy who used to make me laugh until my sides ached. "That might take a while. 48 years is a lot of ground to cover." "We have time," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Unless you need to be somewhere else?" "No," he said softly. "No, I don't need to be anywhere else." The wine helped, loosening the careful politeness that had settled between us like dust on unused furniture. James told me about California, about the architecture firm he'd built from nothing, about Maria, his wife of 39 years who had died from cancer 18 months ago. He showed me pictures on his phone, grandchildren with his eyes, Maria in her garden, the house he designed for them in Marin County. I found myself telling him about Robert, about the children, about the years of PTA meetings and soccer games and family vacations to the same lake cottage every summer, about Robert's slow decline, the way Alzheimer's had stolen him piece by piece until I was caring for a stranger who sometimes remembered my name, about the relief I felt when he finally passed and the guilt that followed. "The worst part," I said, surprising myself by voicing something I'd never told Linda or my sons, was that I grieved for him twice. Once when he stopped being himself, and again when he died. By the end, I felt like a widow long before I actually was one. James reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His skin was warm, mapped with age spots and surgical scars, but familiar somehow. "I understand," he said. "Maria was unconscious for the last 2 weeks. I used to sit there and remember all our conversations, trying to figure out when we'd had our last real one. When did I stop being her husband and start being her caretaker? It's impossible to pinpoint, but you know it happened." We sat in comfortable silence, our hands connected across a restaurant table, while other diners laughed and argued and fell in love around us. I felt like I was watching our younger selves from a great distance, two people who had once believed love was simple, who had learned otherwise through decades of compromise and loss and small daily kindnesses. "Why did you leave?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, carrying all the hurt I thought I'd buried years ago. "We were supposed to be engaged. You had the ring, James. I saw it in your jacket pocket." His hand tightened around mine. "I was terrified," he said simply. 21 years old, and terrified that if I married you, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering who I could have been. Your father had already offered me that job at his insurance agency. I could see our whole life mapped out. House on Maple Street, kids, Sunday dinners at your parents'. It was everything I thought I wanted, until suddenly it felt like prison. "So you ran?" I ran. He met my eyes, and I saw the shame he'd been carrying all these years. I told myself it was better to hurt you once than to make you unhappy for a lifetime. I was young and stupid and convinced I was being noble. "You were being cowardly," I said, but without heat. The anger had burned itself out decades ago, leaving only understanding and a strange kind of tenderness. "Yes," he agreed, "I was being cowardly and selfish, and I've regretted it every day since." The admission hung between us, raw and honest. part of me wanted to tell him how his leaving had shaped me, how it had made me grab onto Robert with both hands when he came along 2 years later, determined never to be abandoned again. How it had taken me years to trust that Robert's quiet steadiness wasn't just another form of cowardice, that staying could be its own kind of bravery. But that felt cruel now, facing this man who had clearly learned his own lessons about love and loss and the weight of choosing to stay. "Tell me about Maria," I said instead. "How did you meet?" His face softened. "At a bookstore in San Francisco, 1976. I was looking for a book on Frank Lloyd Wright, and she was the one who helped me find it. She was studying art history, working part-time to pay for school. I asked her to coffee, and she said yes." "Love at first sight?" "Love at first conversation," he corrected. She was brilliant, Margaret, funny and passionate about things I'd never thought about, art and history and the way buildings could make people feel. She saw the world differently than I did, and she taught me to see it through her eyes. I heard the love in his voice even now and felt a complicated mix of jealousy and gratitude. Jealousy for the woman who had gotten to grow old with him, to learn his morning routines and his favorite songs, and the way he looked when he was thinking hard about something. Gratitude that he had found that kind of love, even if it hadn't been with me. "She sounds wonderful," I said, and meant it. "She would have liked you," James said. "Actually, she knew about you. I told her everything when we got serious. She used to tease me about my Seattle sweetheart and say that someday she'd like to meet the woman who had such good taste in men." The thought of his wife knowing about me, joking about me even, felt strange and comforting. "Robert knew about you too," I admitted. "Not everything, but enough. He knew you were the reason I was so careful with my heart at first." "Did you love him?" The question was quiet, almost hesitant. "Yes," I said without hesitation, "differently than I loved you, but yes, completely. He was my partner, my best friend, the father of my children. We built a life together that was exactly what it was supposed to be." "Good," James said, and I could tell he meant it. "I'm glad you were happy, Margaret." "I'm glad you found what you were looking for." But had I found what I was looking for? Sitting across from James, feeling things I hadn't felt in decades, the flutter of attraction, the spark of chemistry, the dangerous hope that maybe it wasn't too late for second chances, I wasn't sure I could answer that question as simply as I had. The waiter refilled our wine glasses and took our dinner order, though I couldn't remember choosing anything from the menu. My attention was entirely focused on James' face, on the way the candlelight played across his features and made him look both older and younger than his 69 years. "What happens now?" I asked when we were alone again. "I don't know," he said. "I didn't expect this, Margaret. When Linda called and said you might be ready to meet someone, I thought maybe we could be friends, that maybe, after all these years, we could find some kind of peace with each other." "And now?" He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. "Now, I feel like that 21-year-old boy again, which is either wonderful or terrifying. I can't decide which." I understood exactly what he meant. The woman I had been at 19 was sitting at this table too, whispering dangerous things about second chances and the way his eyes still crinkled when he smiled. But she was joined by all the other women I had been, the young mother, the devoted wife, the caregiver, the widow. All of them had opinions about what I should do next. "Linda thinks I'm ready to date," I said. "She's been pushing me to put myself out there since the funeral. But I don't think she understands that at our age, dating isn't about finding someone to grow old with. It's about finding someone to be old with." James laughed at that, a real laugh that transformed his whole face. That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. "Robert used to say that growing old together was our greatest accomplishment," I continued. "More important than the business or the kids or the house. We learned each other's rhythms, accommodated each other's limitations. We became a team." And now? Now I'm not sure I know how to be on a team of one, let alone how to join a new team. Our dinners arrived, chicken parmesan for him, salmon for me, and we ate slowly, talking around the big questions that hovered between us. He told me about his grandchildren's visits, about the garden he was trying to maintain in Maria's memory, about the loneliness of cooking for one. I told him about my book club, about my volunteer work at the library, about the way silence had become both my enemy and my closest companion. Normal things, the kind of conversations people our age had every day. But underneath it all was the electric current of our shared history, the knowledge that we were not just two lonely people sharing a meal. We were two people who had once promised each other forever, who had failed at keeping that promise, and who were now old enough to understand what forever actually meant. As we shared tiramisu and argued about who would pay the check, James won, gallantly, I realized that something was shifting inside me. The careful walls I had built around my heart since Robert's death were developing cracks, and through those cracks, light was beginning to seep in. "There's something else," James said as we prepared to leave. "Something I should tell you before we decide what comes next." My heart stuttered. Here it was, the revelation that would explain everything or ruin everything. The secret wife, the terminal illness, the reason this was all too good to be true. "I'm not Harold Morrison," he said with a slight smile, "but I do live in Linda's neighborhood now. I moved here 6 months ago to be closer to my daughter after Maria died. I've been thinking about reaching out to you, but I didn't have the courage. When Linda called and suggested this meeting, it felt like fate." "Fate," I repeated, "or a very clever daughter who knows more than she lets on." "Probably both." He stood and offered me his arm, the gesture automatic and courtly. "May I walk you to your car?" Outside, the October air was crisp and sharp, smelling of fallen leaves and the promise of rain. James had parked next to me, another gift from Linda, I suspected, and we stood between our cars like teenagers reluctant to end a first date. "Margaret," he said, my name soft in his mouth. "I know this is complicated. I know we're not the same people we were, and I know that starting over at our age is probably foolish." "Probably," I agreed. "But I'd like to see you again, not as Harold and Margaret, but as ourselves, as who we are now." I looked up at him, this man who had been my first love and my first heartbreak, who had taught me both to trust and to doubt, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Dangerous, foolish, absolutely necessary hope. "I'd like that too," I said. He kissed my cheek, soft and careful, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, different from the aftershave he'd worn as a young man, but still him somehow, still the scent that would forever mean possibility to me. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Coffee? Somewhere less dramatic than this?" "Tomorrow," I agreed. I watched him drive away, then sat in my own car for a long time, processing what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "How did it go with Harold? Call me when you get home." I smiled and typed back, "We need to talk. Your Harold isn't who you said he was." Her response came immediately. "I know. Are you mad?" I considered the question seriously. Was I mad? I was confused, exhilarated, terrified, and more alive than I'd felt in years. But mad? No. "Ask me tomorrow," I replied. As I drove home through familiar streets that suddenly seemed full of new possibilities, I thought about Robert, about the life we'd built together, and the love that had sustained us through 4 decades. I thought about James, about the young man who had broken my heart, and the older man who might just have the chance to heal it. And I thought about myself, Margaret Chen, widow, mother, grandmother, and apparently woman still capable of surprise. At 67, I was learning that love didn't end with death or even with heartbreak. It just changed shape, evolved, adapted to new circumstances and older hearts. The woman in the coral lipstick who had walked into that restaurant was not the same woman driving home. She had been cracked open by possibility and transformed by the radical idea that it might not be too late for a second chance at happiness. Tomorrow, I would have coffee with James Castellano and see what happened next. Tonight, I would call Linda and pretend to be annoyed while secretly thanking her for her beautiful, meddling heart. But first, I would sit in my kitchen with a cup of tea and remember what it felt like to be seen by someone who had known me when I was young and fearless and believed in forever. I would remember what it felt like to be a woman rather than just a widow, and I would allow myself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, love at 67 could be even more precious than love at 19. The coral lipstick was gone by now, worn away by wine and conversation and the gentle kiss on my cheek. But the woman who had put it on was still here, still hoping, still willing to take chances on impossible things like second acts and second loves and the radical notion that happy endings were possible at any age. I woke the next morning with butterflies in my stomach, actual butterflies, the kind I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom curtains, and for the first time in months, I felt eager to face the day instead of simply resigned to enduring it. Coffee with James at 10 o'clock at the little cafe on Pine Street where Robert and I used to go on Sunday mornings after church. The irony wasn't lost on me, but somehow it felt right. Robert had always said that the best relationships were built on friendship, on shared coffee and easy conversation. If James and I were going to explore whatever this was between us, it made sense to start with the simple pleasure of each other's company. I spent longer than necessary choosing my outfit, jeans and a soft blue sweater that Linda had given me for Christmas, comfortable shoes for walking. I was putting on earrings when my phone rang. "Mom?" Linda's voice was cautious, tentative. "Are you speaking to me today?" "That depends," I said, holding the phone between my shoulder and ear as I fastened the second earring. "How long have you been planning this little setup?" "Since Dad's funeral," she admitted. "I know that sounds awful, but I saw how lost you looked, and I remembered you telling me about James years ago, about how he was your first love. When I found him online and saw that his wife had died too, it felt like fate." "You've been talking to him for 6 weeks and didn't tell me?" "I was afraid you'd say no. I was afraid you'd convince yourself you weren't ready." Linda's voice grew stronger, more confident. "But Mom, you should have seen your face when you talked about him. Even after all these years, there was still something there." I sat down on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, trying to find the words to explain the complexity of what I was feeling. "Honey, what if this is a mistake? What if we're both just lonely and confused and trying to recapture something that was never meant to last?" "What if you're not?" Linda shot back. "What if this is exactly what both of you need? What if love doesn't have an expiration date?" Out of the mouths of babes, my 38-year-old baby dispensing wisdom about love to her mother. "Are you nervous?" she asked, her voice gentler now. "Terrified," I admitted. "Good. Dad always said you were at your best when you were a little scared." The mention of Robert made my chest tighten. What would he think about this, Linda? Really? "He'd want you to be happy, Mom. He'd want you to be alive instead of just existing." Linda paused. "And honestly, I think he'd like James. From what I could tell in our phone conversations, he's a good man who's been through a lot. Dad would respect that." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with my morning tea, looking out at the garden Robert had planted and I had been struggling to maintain. The roses needed pruning, the vegetable patch was overrun with weeds, and the apple tree was dropping fruit I didn't have the energy to gather. But for the first time since Robert died, the neglected garden didn't feel like a reproach. It felt like possibility, space for something new to grow, even if I wasn't sure yet what that something might be. The drive to the cafe took 15 minutes, during which I had at least 4 conversations with myself about turning around and going home, but I didn't. I parked, checked my lipstick in the mirror, a softer shade today, more appropriate for morning coffee, and walked into the place where James was already waiting. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed he'd chosen a table by the window where the morning light would be kind to both of us. He was wearing khakis and a green button-down shirt that brought out his eyes, and he looked nervous in a way that was both endearing and reassuring. At least I wasn't the only one feeling like a teenager on a first date. "You came?" he said, as if there had been some doubt. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might come to your senses." He pulled out my chair, another courtly gesture that made my heart flutter embarrassingly. "I thought you might decide this was all too complicated." "It is too complicated," I said, settling into my seat, "but I came anyway." He smiled at that, the same smile that had made me fall in love with him at 19. Some things, I realized, truly didn't change. We ordered coffee. He remembered that I liked mine black, which surprised me, and fell into the kind of easy conversation that felt both new and familiar. He asked about my children, and I found myself telling him stories I hadn't shared in years, about Michael's divorce and his struggle to connect with his teenage son, about David's success as a doctor and his wife's battle with infertility, about Linda's fierce protectiveness of everyone she loved, and how she'd inherited that trait from both her parents. In return, James told me about his daughter Sarah, who lived in Portland with her 2 children, and his son Paul, who had followed in his father's footsteps as an architect, but specialized in sustainable design. About the pride he felt watching them build their own lives, and the loneliness of having no one to share that pride with. Maria was the family communicator, he explained. She remembered everyone's birthdays, organized the holidays, kept us all connected. Since she died, I feel like I'm watching my family drift apart, and I don't know how to pull us back together. "It takes time," I said. After Robert died, the kids didn't know how to relate to me as just me instead of half of us. We're still figuring it out. Do you think we ever really figure it out, or do we just get better at pretending we have? The question was so honest, so perfectly capturing the uncertainty I've been living with for months that I had to pause before answering. I think maybe we get better at being okay with not knowing. Maybe that's what wisdom is, being comfortable with uncertainty. "That's very philosophical for a Wednesday morning," James said, but his eyes were warm with appreciation. "I've had a lot of time to think lately." We talked about books. He was reading a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright. I was working my way through Louise Penny's Inspector Gamache series. About travel, places we'd been with our spouses, places we'd always wanted to go, but somehow never made it. About the strange reality of being people who remembered when gas was 30 cents a gallon, but who also carried computers in our pockets. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in science fiction," James said. "My grandson video calls me from college, and I can see his dorm room in real time. When I was his age, long-distance phone calls were a luxury." "Linda tries to teach me things on my phone, and I feel like I'm learning a foreign language," I said. "But then I watch her navigate the world, and I'm amazed that we raised these people who are so much more capable than we ever were." Did we do that? Raise people better than ourselves? "I think maybe we did," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I think maybe that's our real accomplishment." The conversation flowed so naturally that I was startled when James checked his watch and announced it was nearly noon. We'd been talking for 2 hours, and it felt like minutes. "I don't want this to end," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed by his honesty. "It doesn't have to," I said, equally surprised by my boldness. "Would you like to walk? There's a park a few blocks from here." Riverside Park was where Robert and I had taken the children when they were small, where we'd pushed them on swings and caught them at the bottom of slides and taught them to feed ducks at the pond. It should have felt strange bringing James there, like some kind of betrayal. Instead, it felt like introducing him to an important part of my life. We walked slowly, not because of age, though my knees certainly appreciated the leisurely pace, but because neither of us wanted to hurry past this unexpected gift of time together. James told me about the house he'd designed for Maria, about the way he'd positioned every window to catch the light at different times of day, about the garden shed planned and planted and tended until she was too sick to continue. "I can't bring myself to change anything," he admitted as we paused by the duck pond. "It's like a museum to our life together." Sarah keeps suggesting I redecorate, maybe make it more my style, but I wouldn't even know where to start. "Robert's study is exactly the way he left it," I said. "His reading glasses are still on the desk next to a book he never finished. Sometimes I sit in his chair just to feel close to him." "Does it help?" "Sometimes. Other times it makes me feel like I'm visiting my own mausoleum." We found a bench overlooking the water and sat in comfortable silence, watching a family of ducks paddle across the surface. The parents shepherded 3 half-grown ducklings who seemed determined to explore in opposite directions, and I found myself smiling at their familiar frustration. "Margaret," James said eventually, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." My stomach clenched. Here it came, the question that would force me to examine what I was really doing, what I really wanted from this unexpected reunion. "Are you doing this because you missed me, or because you're lonely?" I considered the question seriously, testing my feelings the way I might probe a sore tooth with my tongue. "Both," I said finally. "I am lonely, James, desperately lonely in ways I didn't know were possible, but that's not why I'm here with you." "Then why are you here?" "Because when I saw you last night, something woke up inside me that I thought was gone forever. Not just the memory of who we used to be, but possibility. The idea that maybe there's still time for something new and beautiful and unexpected." He reached for my hand, and I let him take it. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from yard work, and wearing his wedding ring alongside them didn't feel wrong anymore. It felt honest, a man who had loved deeply and was brave enough to risk loving again. "I was afraid you were going to say it was just loneliness," he said, "because I could understand that, but I couldn't build anything real on it." "What do you want to build?" I asked. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I want to find out. I want to see where this goes, what we could become together. I want to introduce you to Sarah and Paul and meet your children. I want to cook dinner for you and argue about what to watch on television. I want ordinary things, Margaret, extraordinary ordinary things." The words hung between us, simple and profound. At 67 and 69, we weren't talking about passion and romance in the way young people did. We were talking about companionship and partnership, about choosing each other daily and building something sustainable and real. "I want that too," I said, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not going to be Maria, and you're not going to be Robert. We can't recreate what we had before with other people." "I wouldn't want to," James said. "What I had with Maria was perfect for who we were then." "What I might have with you would be perfect for who we are now. And who are we now?" He considered this, watching the ducks reorganize themselves into a neat line behind their mother. Wiser, I hope, certainly more patient. We know now that love isn't just about feelings. It's about choosing each other over and over again, especially when it's difficult. We're also more fragile, I pointed out, more set in our ways. We have health problems and grown children with opinions and decades of habits that might not be compatible. We have less time, he agreed, but that makes every day more precious, doesn't it? A young couple walked past us, pushing a stroller and arguing quietly about something, directions maybe, or whose turn it was to change the baby. They looked tired and frustrated and completely absorbed in the complexity of their shared life. I remembered being them, being so caught up in the daily mechanics of marriage and parenthood that I sometimes forgot to notice how lucky I was. Do you think they know? I asked James, nodding toward the young couple who were now consulting their phones with the intense concentration of people trying to solve a crisis. Know what? How precious this is. The arguing, the exhaustion, even the baby crying. Do you think they know they're living in the good old days right now? James watched them for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Probably not. I didn't know when Sarah was that age and Paul was learning to walk and Maria was always tired from night feedings. I thought the good part would come later when things got easier. But things never really got easier, did they? They just got different. No, he agreed, they got different. But by the time I figured that out, Sarah was in high school and Paul was driving, and Maria and I were looking at each other across the dinner table, wondering where the years had gone. I understood exactly what he meant. Robert and I had spent so many years waiting for the next phase, when the children would sleep through the night, when they'd be in school, when they'd graduate, when we'd have time for ourselves again. But time for ourselves had turned out to be retirement and grandchildren and doctor's appointments, and eventually his illness consuming everything we thought we'd save time for. Maybe that's the gift of being our age, I said. We know now that there's no perfect time coming later. There's only now. Is that what this is for you, embracing now? I thought about it, testing the weight of his words. I think it's bigger than that. I think it's about choosing to believe that our story isn't over yet, that maybe the best chapters are still to be written. James squeezed my hand. I like that, the idea that we're not just epilogues to other people's lives. We sat quietly for a while longer, and I found myself studying his profile, the way his hair curled slightly behind his ears, the laugh lines that had deepened over the decades, the small scar on his chin that I didn't remember from when we were young. This was a face that had lived, that had seen joy and grief and everything in between. It was so much more interesting than the smooth, unlined face of this boy I'd fallen in love with 48 years ago. James, I said eventually, I want to tell you something, but I need you to let me finish before you respond. He turned to face me fully, and I saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. All right. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. When you left, it nearly destroyed me. Not just the leaving, but the way you left. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. I waited for months, thinking you'd come back or call or write. I made excuses for you to everyone who asked. I defended you even when you weren't there to defend yourself. His face tightened with old shame, but he didn't interrupt. It took me 2 years to accept that you weren't coming back. 2 years to stop looking for you in crowds, to stop hoping every phone call might be you. When I finally met Robert, I was so careful with my heart that he had to court me for 8 months before I believed he was serious about staying. Margaret, let me finish, I said gently. I need you to understand that your leaving changed me. It made me cautious in ways that probably cost me some joy in my marriage to Robert, but it also made me appreciate what I had with him, made me never take his presence for granted. James was quiet, waiting for me to continue. So here's what I need to say. I forgive you. Not just for leaving, but for the way you left. We were young and scared and making decisions with incomplete information about who we were and what we wanted. I understand that now in a way I couldn't then. His eyes filled with tears, and I realized mine were doing the same. But I also need you to understand that if we do this, if we try to build something together now, I need you to promise me that we'll talk about the hard things, that if you get scared or have doubts, you'll tell me instead of disappearing. I can handle a lot of things at my age, but I can't handle being abandoned again." "I promise," he said without hesitation. "Margaret, I promise you that. Whatever happens between us, I will never leave without saying goodbye. I will never leave you wondering." The sincerity in his voice, the immediate certainty of his response, loosened something in my chest that I hadn't even realized was still tight. "Thank you," I said simply. We sat in silence again, but it felt different now. Cleaner, more honest. The afternoon sun was getting stronger, and other people were beginning to fill the park. Joggers, dog walkers, families with children. Normal people living their normal lives, unaware that two old people on a bench had just renegotiated a 48-year-old heartbreak. "Can I ask you something now?" James said. "Of course." "What do you want, Margaret? Not what you think you should want, not what Linda wants for you, but what you actually want for yourself." It was such a simple question, but I realized I hadn't asked it of myself in years. During Robert's illness, what I wanted had seemed irrelevant. He needed care, so I provided it. After his death, what I wanted had felt selfish. Shouldn't I be grieving properly instead of thinking about my own needs? "I want to feel useful again," I said, slowly, thinking out loud. "I want to have someone to cook for who appreciates my cooking. I want to argue about silly things, like what temperature to keep the house and whether we need to watch the news every night. I want to plan trips we might not be healthy enough to take, and I want someone to remember stories with. What else? I want to be touched again. Not just sexually, though that would be nice too if we get there, but I want someone to hold my hand during movies and rub my shoulders when they're sore and hug me just because. I want to matter to someone in a daily way again." James nodded as if this made perfect sense. I want those things too. But I also want to be surprised again. I want to discover things about you I never knew. You might not like what you're like when you're completely comfortable with someone, what you're like when you're cranky or tired or excited about something. You might not like what you find, I warned him. I'm more opinionated than I used to be. I have very firm feelings about how the dishwasher should be loaded, and I can't tolerate people who talk during movies. I leave my reading glasses all over the house, and I sometimes forget to turn off lights when I leave a room, he countered. I also have strong opinions about the correct way to fold towels. We were both laughing now, the kind of laughter that comes from recognizing the absurdity and beauty of human particularity. "Are we really going to do this?" I asked. "Two old people starting over?" "We're not starting over," James corrected. "We're starting fresh. There's a difference. Starting over means pretending the past didn't happen. Starting fresh means building something new on the foundation of everything we've learned." I liked that distinction. It felt honest and hopeful without being naive. "So, what's the next step?" I asked. "Dinner," he said promptly. "Tomorrow night. I'll cook for you. Nothing fancy, just something simple we can eat while we continue figuring this out." "At your house?" "If you're comfortable with that. I know it's still very much Maria's house, but I think it's time for me to start making it mine too. Our space, if you're willing." The invitation felt significant, more intimate than sharing a meal in a restaurant. It meant seeing how he lived now, meeting the ghosts of his life with Mariah, beginning the delicate process of creating new memories in spaces shaped by old ones. "I'd like that," I said. We exchanged phone numbers, a ridiculous formality given that we'd known each other since we were teenagers, but necessary now that we were different people with different lives. James walked me to my car, and this time when he kissed my cheek goodbye, I turned slightly so our lips almost met. Almost, but not quite. Some things we both seemed to understand were worth savoring slowly. "Tomorrow at 6?" he asked. "Tomorrow at 6, I confirmed. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months, humming along to the radio for the first time since Robert died. The house felt less empty when I walked in, as if the possibility of sharing it again, even just the idea of having stories to tell someone who would want to hear them, had breathed life back into the rooms. I called Linda to report on the coffee date, carefully editing my account to include the important details while leaving out the most vulnerable moments. She was thrilled, of course, and insisted on coming over the next day to help me choose an outfit for dinner. "I can't believe this is working," she said. "I mean, I hoped it would, but I was also prepared for it to be a disaster." "It still might be a disaster," I pointed out. "We're both carrying a lot of history, Linda. This isn't a simple romance." "The best ones never are," she said, with the confidence of someone who'd been happily married for 15 years. "Complex doesn't mean impossible, Mom. It just means interesting." That evening, I found myself moving through my bedtime routine with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. I chose my clothes for the next day, considered what wine I might bring to dinner, and spent longer than usual on my skincare routine. Small vanities that felt like acts of hope. As I lay in bed, I thought about Robert, about the life we'd built together, and the love that had sustained us for 4 decades. I felt his presence not as a reproach, but as a blessing, as if he were somehow giving me permission to find happiness again. "Be happy, Maggie," I could almost hear him saying, using the nickname only he had ever called me. "Be happy and don't feel guilty about it." Sleep came easily, filled with dreams of possibilities I was finally brave enough to consider. James lived in a craftsman-style house 15 minutes from my own neighborhood, with a neat front yard and flower boxes that showed Maria's touch even in their current state of gentle neglect. I sat in my car for a moment before walking to the front door, smoothing my dress, a simple blue shift that Linda had declared perfect for a dinner date with someone who already knows you're beautiful, and checking my lipstick one more time. He answered the door before I could knock, wearing an apron over khakis and a button-down shirt, looking flustered and endearing. "I may have been overly ambitious with the menu," he said by way of greeting. "Nothing's on fire, but I can't promise everything will be ready at the same time." "I brought wine," I said, holding up the bottle of Pinot Grigio I'd chosen after 20 minutes of indecision at the liquor store. "And I'm very good at keeping cooks company while they panic." He laughed and stepped aside to let me in, and I got my first real look at the life he'd built with Maria. The house was beautiful, all warm wood and carefully chosen antiques, with built-in bookcases and large windows that let in generous amounts of natural light. But there was a stillness to it, a museum quality, that spoke of a space being preserved rather than lived in. Family photos covered the mantel and side tables. James and Maria at various ages, their children growing up, grandchildren posed in formal family portraits. I studied them while James opened the wine, trying to reconcile the young man I'd known with the man who'd lived this very different life. "She was beautiful," I said, pausing at a photo of Maria in her garden, silver-haired and laughing as she held up an enormous tomato. "Inside and out," James agreed, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of wine. "She would have liked you, Margaret. She always said I had good taste in women, just questionable timing." The kitchen smelled wonderful, garlic and herbs and something that might have been chicken. James had set the small breakfast table by the window with cloth napkins and the kind of careful attention to detail that spoke of someone trying to make a good impression. "How can I help?" I asked. "You can tell me about your day while I try to remember how to cook for 2 people, he said, stirring something on the stove. "I've gotten used to opening a can of soup and calling it dinner." I found myself falling easily into the rhythm of kitchen conversation, leaning against the counter with my wine glass while James moved between the stove and the oven with the focused concentration of someone determined not to burn dinner. We talked about small things, a book I was reading, a documentary he'd watched, the weather forecast that called for rain over the weekend. Normal conversation, the kind married couples had every evening in kitchens all over the world. But underneath it was the electric awareness of each other, the knowledge that we were trying on the shape of domestic intimacy to see how it fit. "Dinner is served," James announced finally, presenting plates of chicken marsala with roasted vegetables and rice pilaf. Or, at least, dinner is ready. Whether it qualifies as served remains to be seen. The food was delicious, clearly the result of someone who had learned to cook by watching someone else do it lovingly for years. We ate by the window as the late afternoon light faded to evening, talking about our children and grandchildren, about the books we'd read and the places we'd traveled. "Sarah's coming for Thanksgiving," James said, refilling our wine glasses. "She wants to meet you if you're interested." The casual way he said it belied the significance of the invitation. Meeting his daughter meant stepping out of the safe space we'd created for ourselves and into the broader world of family and opinions and people who might not understand what we were trying to build together. "I'm terrified of meeting her," I admitted. "What if she thinks I'm trying to replace her mother?" "What if she thinks you're exactly what her old man needs to stop rattling around this house like a lonely ghost?" he countered. "Sarah wants me to be happy, Margaret. She's worried about me, about the way I've been since Maria died. If she sees that you make me smile again, she'll love you for that alone." "And if she doesn't?" "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. "One of the advantages of being our age is that we don't need anyone's permission to be happy." After dinner, James gave me a tour of the house, showing me Maria's art studio upstairs, the guest room where his grandchildren stayed when they visited, the master bedroom he'd barely been able to sleep in since she died. Each room told the story of a life fully lived, of two people who had built something beautiful together over nearly 4 decades. "It must be hard," I said, as we stood in the doorway of the studio, looking at canvases Maria would never finish, being surrounded by reminders. "It was at first," James admitted. "Everything felt like a reproach, like the house was asking why I was still here when she wasn't. But lately, it's been more like conversation, like she's still here in some way, approving of the changes I'm finally ready to make." "What kind of changes?" He was quiet for a moment, then led me back downstairs to the living room. "I've been thinking about redecorating the bedroom, maybe painting the guest room so it feels more welcoming. Small things, but they feel enormous." We settled on the couch with fresh glasses of wine, and I found myself studying the family photos again. In every picture, James and Maria looked genuinely happy together. Not the forced smiles of people posing for cameras, but the relaxed joy of people who truly enjoyed each other's company. "Were you happy?" I asked. "Really happy for all those years?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Not every day, not every moment. We had our struggles, our arguments, our periods of feeling like strangers. But yes, we were happy. We built something good together." "I'm glad," I said, and meant it. "I'm glad you had that." "Are you? Really? It can't be easy, hearing about the life I chose instead of the one I might have had with you." I considered the question seriously, examining my heart for traces of jealousy or resentment. "I think I'm grateful for it," I said finally. "If you'd been miserable, if you'd spent 40 years regretting leaving me, that would be terrible for both of us. But knowing that you were happy, that you found love and built a good life, that makes the hurt worth something." James reached for my hand, and this time I didn't hesitate to take his. "You're remarkable. Do you know that? The girl I knew was sweet and loving, but this woman, you're wise and generous and stronger than you realize." "I had good teachers," I said. pain and loss, and 43 years of marriage to a good man who showed me what love looks like when it's chosen every day instead of just felt. We talked until nearly 10 o'clock, sharing stories and memories and gradually building the bridge between who we had been and who we were becoming. When James walked me to my car, the October air was crisp and sharp, smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. "Margaret," he said as I searched for my keys, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." My heart stuttered. "What is it?" "Would you consider going away with me for a weekend, somewhere neutral, where we can spend time together away from all the reminders of our other lives? I want to see what we're like when it's just us, without the ghosts." The suggestion was both thrilling and terrifying. A weekend away would be intimate in ways that coffee dates and dinner couldn't prepare us for. It would mean sharing space, negotiating morning routines, seeing each other without the careful preparation that had marked our meetings so far. "I'll think about it," I promised. "That's all I ask," he said, and kissed me good night, not on the cheek this time, but soft and sweet on the lips, a question and an answer all at once. I drove home with my heart racing and my mind spinning with possibilities. A weekend away with James. At 67 years old, I was contemplating what my grandmother would have called a romantic getaway, and the thought made me feel both ancient and impossibly young. At home, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the garden that needed tending and the life that needed rebuilding. The house felt different tonight, not empty, but expectant, as if it too were waiting to see what choices I would make. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Thank you for a perfect evening. Sweet dreams." I typed back, "Thank you for cooking for me. It's been a long time since someone took care of me like that." His response came quickly. "Get used to it." 3 simple words that carried the weight of possibility, of promises and potential, and the radical idea that care could flow both ways in a relationship built by 2 people who had learned the difference between wanting and needing someone. I went to bed that night thinking about weekend getaways and meeting grown children and the delicate dance of building intimacy with someone who knew both versions of me, the girl I had been and the woman I had become. Somewhere in the space between fear and hope, I was beginning to believe that maybe Linda had been right. Maybe love didn't have an expiration date. Maybe the best chapters of our story were still waiting to be written. The weekend away materialized faster than I'd expected. James called 3 days later with a proposal, a bed and breakfast in the Columbia River Gorge, 2 hours from Seattle, with hiking trails and a view of the water and what he described as the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think. "I booked 2 rooms," he said carefully. "No pressure, no assumptions, just time and space to see what happens naturally." I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Linda was beside herself with excitement when I told her, immediately launching into a campaign to help me pack and offering unsolicited advice about rekindling romance at your age. I loved her enthusiasm, but I also needed her to understand that this wasn't the same as her college roommate stories about weekend trips to wine country. "Honey," I said as she held up a negligee she'd apparently purchased for the occasion, "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure I'm ready for all that." "Mom," she said gently, "I'm not suggesting you jump into bed with him. I'm suggesting you pack as if you're a woman who's open to possibilities. There's a difference." She was right, of course. I had been packing like a woman afraid of her own desires, choosing the most conservative clothes I owned and avoiding anything that might suggest I was thinking of James as more than a friend. But the truth was, I was thinking of him as more than a friend, much more. The drive to the Columbia River Gorge was beautiful, winding through forests just beginning to turn color and offering glimpses of the river between the trees. James had suggested we drive separately so we could each leave whenever we felt ready, but I found myself hoping we'd stay for the full 2 nights we'd booked. The bed and breakfast was exactly what he'd promised, a restored Victorian house with wraparound porches and gardens that even in late October were lovely. Our rooms were across the hall from each other, both with views of the river and fireplaces that the innkeeper promised to light if the evenings turned cool. "This is beautiful," I said as we stood on the front porch looking out at the water. "How did you find it?" "Maria and I stayed here for our 20th anniversary," James said, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "James," I interrupted gently, "it's okay. You don't have to edit your life with her out of our conversations. She was part of your story for 40 years. I expect her to come up." He relaxed visibly. "I wasn't sure how you'd feel about that. Some people want a clean slate." "I don't want a clean slate," I said. "I want honesty. I want to know all of you, including the parts that were shaped by loving her." We spent the afternoon walking the trails that wound through the forest and along the river, talking easily about everything and nothing. James pointed out birds I didn't recognize and told me stories about bringing his grandchildren here to fish. I shared memories of camping trips with Robert and the children, of the way Michael had been afraid of bears and David had insisted on sleeping outside even when it rained. "We're going to have a lot of stories to sort through," James said as we stopped to rest on a bench overlooking the water. 48 years of separate experiences to share with each other. "Is that what we're doing? Sharing our lives?" "I hope so," he said, "if you're willing." That evening, we had dinner in the inn's small dining room at a table by the window where we could watch the sunset over the river. The other guests were younger couples celebrating anniversaries or romantic getaways, and I felt simultaneously self-conscious and proud to be part of their number. "Do you think they're wondering what we're doing here?" I asked James as a couple in their 30s exchanged wedding rings at the table next to ours. "Probably," he said, "but do you care?" I considered the question. Did I care? A month ago, I would have been mortified by the thought of people speculating about my love life. Now, watching James' face in the candlelight and feeling the warm glow of wine and good conversation, I found I didn't care at all. "No," I said, "I don't care." "Good," James said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "because I'd like to be one of those couples people wonder about. I'd like to be the old man who's obviously smitten with his beautiful companion." The compliment made me blush like a teenager, and I felt a flutter of the same excitement I'd felt when he'd first asked me to dance at a church social 48 years ago. After dinner, we walked the grounds of the inn, following paths lit by small lanterns and breathing in the clean, cool air that smelled of river water and pine. The silence between us was comfortable, expectant in the best way. "Margaret," James said as we paused at a gazebo overlooking the water, "may I ask you something personal?" "We're spending the weekend together, James. I think we're past a point of formal permission for personal questions." He smiled at that. "Fair enough. Have you thought about physical intimacy? About what you want from this relationship?" The question hung in the air between us, honest and necessary and terrifying. I had been thinking about it, of course, but in the abstract way of someone afraid to examine her own desires too closely. "I have," I said carefully. "But I'm not sure I know how to answer. It's been 6 months since Robert died, and our physical relationship had been limited for the last few years of his illness. I'm not sure I remember how to be intimate with someone." "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," James said gently, "or this weekend, or even this month. But I want you to know that I'm attracted to you, Margaret, not just to the memory of who you were, but to who you are now. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to explore that with you." The honesty of his words, the patience in his voice, made something relax in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. "I'd like that too," I said, "when I'm ready, when we're both ready." He kissed me then, soft and sweet at first, then deeper as I responded. It had been so long since I'd been kissed with desire instead of comfort that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted as a woman instead of just needed as a caregiver. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I felt a flutter of panic alongside the desire. "Too fast?" James asked, reading my expression. "No," I said, "just overwhelming. In a good way, I think." We walked back to the inn hand in hand, and at the top of the stairs, we paused outside our respective rooms. "Good night, Margaret," James said, kissing my hand like something out of an old movie. "Good night, James." I lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me and thinking about desire and fear and the complicated dance of intimacy at our age. Part of me wanted to knock on James's door, to take the risk of reaching for what I wanted instead of waiting for permission. But a larger part of me was grateful for the space, for the time to process what was happening between us without the pressure of immediate decisions. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of Robert, but not the confused, diminished man he had become at the end. I dreamed of Robert as he had been in his prime, healthy and loving and wise. And in the dream, he took my hands and smiled. "Be happy, Maggie," he said, just as I'd imagined. "Be happy and don't feel guilty about it. You deserve love and you deserve to give love. Don't let fear rob you of what time you have left." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but lightness in my heart, as if I'd been given permission I didn't know I needed. The next morning, James and I had breakfast on the porch, sharing the newspaper and arguing mildly about the crossword puzzle. Normal couple behavior that felt both foreign and natural, like trying on clothes that fit perfectly but were made for someone you weren't sure you remembered how to be. "I had an idea," James said as we finished our coffee. "There's something I'd like to show you if you're up for a short drive." "What kind of something?" "A surprise, but a good one, I promise." An hour later, we were standing in front of a small white church in the countryside, surrounded by vineyards and rolling hills. It was the kind of place that appeared on postcards, picturesque and peaceful and somehow timeless. "James," I said, recognition dawning, "this is—" "The church where Maria and I were married," he said, 39 years ago next month. "I wanted to bring you here because I wanted you to see that I'm not trying to recreate the past. I'm trying to honor it while building something new." I studied his face, trying to understand what he was asking of me. "What does that mean?" "It means I loved Maria completely, and I'll always love her. But I'm learning to love you, too. Differently, but just as truly. It means I want to introduce you to all the parts of my life, even the sacred ones." We walked around the church grounds, James telling me stories about their wedding day, about the friends who had gathered to celebrate with them, about the young couple they had been who thought they understood what forever meant. "Do you miss it?" I asked, being married. "Every day," he said without hesitation. "Not just the big things, but the small ones. Having someone to share the news with, someone to ask about my day, someone who knows how I like my coffee and remembers to buy the kind of bread I prefer." "The infrastructure of love," I said. "Exactly. The daily practice of caring for someone and being cared for in return." We sat on a bench in the churchyard, surrounded by the peaceful quiet of the countryside, and I felt something shift inside me. This man, who had brought me to the place where he'd promised forever to someone else, was showing me that love didn't have to be exclusive or competitive, that honoring one relationship didn't diminish another. "James," I said, "I want to tell you something." "I'm listening." "I think I'm falling in love with you. Not the way I loved you when we were young, but the way I can love you now, with everything I've learned about what love actually means." He turned to face me fully, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think I'm falling in love with you too, Margaret, and it terrifies me because I know how much it hurts to lose someone you love completely." "Then we'll just have to be brave enough to love each other anyway," I said. Because the alternative is living the rest of our lives afraid of our own hearts. He kissed me then, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's promises and the possibility of our own, and I tasted salt from tears I wasn't sure belonged to him or me or both of us. When we drove back to Seattle the next day, we rode in comfortable silence, both of us processing what had happened between us over the weekend. As we pulled into my driveway, James reached for my hand. "I want to keep seeing you," he said, regularly, seriously, with intention. "I want to meet your children and introduce you to mine." I want to argue about politics and grocery shop together and figure out how two old people navigate a relationship in the modern world. What are you asking me, James? "Am asking if you'll be my girlfriend," he said with a self-deprecating laugh, which sounds ridiculous at our age, but I don't know what else to call it. "I like girlfriend," I said. "It sounds like possibility." "So, is that a yes?" "That's a yes." As I watched him drive away, I felt the weight of decision settling around me like a comfortable coat. I was 67 years old, and I was someone's girlfriend. I was going to learn the rhythms of a new relationship, navigate the opinions of grown children, and risk my heart on the radical idea that love could bloom more than once in a lifetime. The house felt different when I walked in, not empty, but full of potential. I called Linda to report on the weekend, carefully editing my account, but unable to hide the happiness in my voice. "Mom," she said when I finished, "you sound different, lighter." "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel like myself again, but a version of myself I didn't know still existed." "And you're happy?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the certainty. "I'm happy." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked out at Robert's garden, thinking about the choices I was making and the life I was choosing to build. Tomorrow, I would start the process of introducing James into my world, of explaining to my children and friends that their grieving widow was becoming someone's girlfriend. Some people would understand, and some wouldn't. Some would think I was being disloyal to Robert's memory, and others would worry that I was moving too fast or making decisions based on loneliness rather than love. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, feeling the residual warmth of James's goodbye kiss on my lips and the promise of tomorrow's phone call in my pocket, I found I didn't care what anyone else thought. I was happy. At 67, after loss and grief and the long journey through the valley of widowhood, I was happy. And that, I realized, was more than enough.